Another great question. What is the Lord's table? The Lord's table is a confused issue, as many of you probably know. It is steeped and has the background of much tradition attached to it. Of course, a resemblance of what took place the night in which the Lord was betrayed, when he took bread and he took a cup and said, "This is my body," and he said, "This is my blood." This is brought up in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 in the context of the Corinthians having a meal together. They would gather together and have a supper. So what is true? Is tradition true with all of its doctrinal baggage attached to it? Or is something else true? When we examine the issue of the Lord's table, we need to keep in mind the issue of the table and the Lord's table. And that table is different than another table, a table of devils, as Paul brings up a chapter earlier in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. The table of devils, hallmarked by the wisdom of the world and what the idol worshippers believe and do, to that of the Lord's table, the blood of the Lord Jesus Christ, resembling the forgiveness of sins purchased by his blood and the atonement. The bread, resembling the issue of his body, doing the will of God and being broken, sacrificed in love for others. This is the Lord's table. We learn in the gospel accounts in Matthew chapter 4 that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God, as the Lord quotes Deuteronomy. Later on in John's gospel, when he is talking about him coming from heaven, him being the true bread of heaven, the bread of life, it's him and an understanding of who he is, and them needing to eat his flesh and to drink his blood. He gives the interpretation in that same passage. The flesh profit you nothing. To eat his flesh would profit you nothing. To drink his actual blood would profit you nothing. But the Spirit giveth life. An understanding and a belief in who the Lord Jesus Christ is and what he would do for them would be something. This is what they need to understand. It was the words of the Lord Jesus Christ in connection with who he was and what he was going to do. Now, we know what happened. The night in which he betrayed, he ushered in this table, his table. This is his body, broken for them. To do this in remembrance of him. To do what exactly? To take a piece of bread and to break it? Sure, they're doing that. But what is that doing? What are they supposed to be doing? Well, if his body was going to be broken for them, then ought they to take their body and be broken for one another? He actually says that later on in John's Gospel. He says, "A new commandment I give unto you, as I've loved you, so love one another." To sacrifice and love one another. This is the feast at the Lord's table. It is a spiritual table of knowing Christ, being conformed to his image, and being like him in your life. To remember the blood, the shed blood, the forgiveness of sins. And if God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven us, so we ought to forgive one another. This was not taking place at Corinth. They were not breaking themselves and sacrificing themselves one for another. All crescendoing in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 when he's got to talk to them about charity. And they're having a meal together. And it isn't the Lord's Supper. It isn't the provision of the Lord and his sacrifice and his shed blood being represented at their meal together. Therefore it was not, they gathered together not to eat the Lord's Supper. It was their own supper. Some were drunk and some were hungry. Some were sick and some were sleeping. They were not thinking about one another. They were thinking about their own belly coming from their pagan feasts. So what is the Lord's table? It's a remembrance of what Christ did for us at Calvary, in breaking his body and sacrifice and shedding his blood for the forgiveness of sins. That we would have that same love towards one another in all that we do. We are identified as the Lord's body. In partaking of the Lord's table, when we have a meal together, it ought to be the Lord's supper. And we ought to show, therefore, in our sacrifice one to another, the Lord's death till he come. It is a matter of understanding, wisdom, and knowledge believed by the Christian and put on display in the household of faith and even towards those that are without. Great question. Keep them coming. Until the next one, look up.